I have a story that I would like to share with you guys today. This is actually a story that I had originally planned, that's kind of noisy, to share on our Christmas Eve service. But after some conversation with my worship team, decided, you know what, this is a perfect story for a new year and for a burning bowl ritual service. And this is a story by Robert Fulghum, who you may know from Everything I Need to Know About Life I Learned About in Kindergarten, right? Those books. What you might not know is that he is a Unitarian Universalist minister. Fun fact. And this is a story of a Christmas Eve service that he led one year at midnight. And he wanted to read a story from long ago, a fairy tale about a wandering juggler who happened into a monastery in the deep of winter and asked for refuge. You may know this story, and if memory serves, the gist of the story is called Our Lady's Juggler. The story says the monks were busy making gifts to lay before the high altar of the monastery in honor of the Virgin Mary, who was about to have her baby. Willing suspension of disbelief, guys. Beautiful gifts, extravagant gifts, rich gifts. Because if she was pleased, her statue would shed a tear of compassion for humanity. But when these gifts were presented at the Feast of the Nativity, the statue didn't do anything. And in the middle of the night, the juggler, who thought he had nothing to give, he was an itinerant juggler, not really a high-end, high-dollar trade. He had no gift to give, but at night he went in alone and he juggled before the statue, and he juggled to the very limit of his capacity, more juggling than he had ever juggled. And to make a long story short, the statue of the Virgin Mary shed a tear, and the baby Jesus in her arms in the statue smiled, because the juggler had given everything he had, holding back nothing in his generosity. Or so the story goes. Now, to bring the story to life, Reverend Fulghum wanted to have a real juggler perform in the congregation first, and then he would tell the story, and it would then become his Christmas sermon, a little showbiz and razzmatazz and pizzazz for the midnight service. It was going to be magnificent. But when the time for the service came, the juggler had not arrived. Not until the middle of the second carol did he see the juggler working his way up the crowded aisles. This is clearly a pre-COVID story because everybody was in the building. He's walking up the aisle, but not in a costume. He's very confused. Reverend Fulghum had specifically asked the juggler to wear a jester outfit, right, with the silly hat and the bells and the multicolored harlequin. And he had no juggling equipment, no balls, no pins, no fire, whatever you might happen to juggle. So much for the magic at midnight, he thought. So while the congregation was heading into a little town of Bethlehem, the juggler and the minister had a whispered conference up in the front. You may have seen this kind of thing happen here. His car had been stolen, and all of his possessions were in that car, and he had lost them. But not to worry, the juggler said. A friend had brought him and would take him home afterward, and he would be fine. In the meantime, he had an idea. All the minister had to do was to tell the fairy story, and he, the juggler, would take it from there. Well, there was no time to argue. They had finished with a little town of Bethlehem. The carol was done, and the service went on. So Reverend Fulghum assumed that when it came time for the juggler's performance, the juggler would explain his circumstances and use some things he'd found in the church kitchen, hopefully not made of glass, for a short act, right? Reasonable enough. Make do. However, Christmas Eve is not a time for reasonable. We ought to know that by now. So he read the story. And the juggler stepped into the light from out of the congregation. Slim man, wiry, athletic, black tennis shoes, black jeans, green turtleneck shirt, solemn expression, and freckles on his face instead of the expected jester makeup. Longish brown hair, nothing special to look at, and no tools of his trade. He smiled, and he began his routine. In fact, he went through his entire, you can tell I'm not a juggler, he went through his entire routine just as if he had brought balls and clubs, that's what they're called, and knives and scarves with him. And we had all seen enough juggling to know that this is not juggling, but we knew what was going on when that juggler started juggling. And in each part of the routine, he went one step further than he had ever juggled, more than we had ever seen. 7 balls is supposed to be the limit for the very best of professional jugglers. Our guy did 8. And we knew it when he did it. And we applauded in his moment of triumph. On through 12 silver scarks in the air at once, 7 knives, and we even knew when he set his torches on fire and got 8 torches in the air all at once and caught them without burning himself. We laughed and shouted encouragement and applauded this remarkable performance. We couldn't see it, but we believed it. We gave him a standing ovation. On Christmas Eve in church, a standing ovation. He held up his hands for silence, and the congregation sat down. But the juggler was not through. He started juggling things we couldn't recognize. What's this? Chickens? Birds? Some kind of tree? Rings? 1 off each finger? 5? 5 rings? 5 golden rings? We got it. The 12 days of Christmas. He was going to juggle one of everything in the 12 days. The partridge, the pear tree, and all the rest. Impossible. But he was going to do it. A swan, a goose, and an egg. I was thinking, he'll never get the maid and the cow off the ground. But with a great heaving effort, he did it. After that, the leaping lady and the dancing lords and the drum and the drummer, piece of cake. Every gift was in the air, way up in the air, because this was a lot of stuff. And as each piece came around, we knew what it was and shouted out its name as he caught it and threw it back up in the air again. Fantastic. Nobody had ever done this before. The juggler was laughing. The congregation cheered like a crowd at a championship game when a last-minute score won it for the home team. The juggler suddenly clapped his hands loudly. That was not very loudly. Clapped his hands loudly and stood still. One finger in front of his lips called for silence, and silence came. We stood looking at him and he at us. In the most powerful and meaningful moment of quiet I've ever witnessed at Christmas Eve. The sermon was supposed to follow the juggler. And it did, but it was not I who spoke. We were all addressed by a sermon of eloquent, instructive silence. The silence in which we absorbed the power of the vision we had just witnessed, the impossible event that we had wished into being. The silence in which we thought about our capacity to realize things we can sometimes only imagine. Some of the most wonderful things have to be believed in order to be seen. Like flying reindeer and angels. Like peace on earth and goodwill and hope and joy. Real because they can be imagined into being. Someone, I don't know who, began to sing Silent Night, as was our tradition. People on the first row lit their small candles from the big candle, passed the flame on to those in the rows behind them. The church filled with light, and we filed out of the church, singing into the night, and went home, taking our light with us.